introduce yourself and the session?
Yeah, sure. So, hello everyone. My name's Will Restall. I work for a company called Hunter Healthcare, which is a healthcare specialist, recruitment, executive search, kind of people services business. Um, my role is overseeing everything that we do in finance in the NHS, and I've been working with the One NHS Finance program for coming up to 3 years now, I think, or just over 3 years, delivering similar kinds of sessions to this, supporting career development, how to enhance your personal network, standing out in applications, all those kind of things. So this session is around the latter, standing out in applications, both kind of on paper and then in the interview setting as well. So we will cover structuring a CV that stands out, how to kind of meticulously plan for an application, and then preparing for the interview day as well. I have left some time for questions at the end, but if anyone has any questions as we go along, then just put up your hand or just feel free to interject. It can be as interactive or uninteractive as people want it, so feel free to just jump in as and when. So, CV writing, I'm sure this isn't really teaching anyone anything they don't necessarily know already. In summary, I would say a CV you should try and keep to between 2 and 3 pages, certainly no more than 3 pages. Particularly as you're getting kind of later on in your career and you have more experience to write about and draw upon. I think the aim is to try and keep it as succinct as possible, particularly when you're also adding a covering statement to that as well. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer to how to structure it, but I think this is something that we tend to land upon as being the most impactful, which is starting with a personal summary. In my mind, this doesn't need to be more than a paragraph. Maybe two at a push, but sometimes you see CVs that the majority of the first page is taken up by a really extensive summary, and I think at that point you probably can't really call it a summary. This just needs to be quite a punchy introduction to who you are, where you're at in your career, what you have kind of done, and what you're hoping to achieve, and perhaps therefore in that section something tailored to the actual role that you're applying to. I would then move straight on to key skills, particularly those that are transferable. So things that you have picked up along any part of your career, as well as those specific to roles you have done recently and roles you are applying to. You'll see a common theme here that there's definitely a narrative to make it very, very targeted to jobs you're applying to. So you might find that you have almost like a skeleton CV that you then kind of chop and change depending on what it is you're applying to. With the career history, I would go obviously reverse chronological order first. So start with the most recent, and particularly where you've got a few more jobs that you would write about, I would go spend the most kind of space on the page and the most time writing about your last two roles, and then everything beyond that can be reduced down to either just the outline of the job, dates, or a couple of bullet points, something like that. Sorry, I did just see that question. I don't think it matters table or bullet points with the key skills. I think however you want to format it is totally up to you. Yeah, question from Paru. Go ahead.
Yeah, under the career history, is it useful to put down like key skills or achievements under each category of career history? Does that make sense?
Yes, I will get on to that.
Oh,
So
okay.
there's
Sorry.
a slide. No worries. So in short, it's totally up to you. Whatever you feel brings out your experience the best. I quite like the structure of having kind of key responsibilities and then key achievements,
Yeah.
and the achievements should be linked to the responsibilities. But I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a couple of slides' time.
Okay.
Um, and then, yeah, following that, education qualifications, any professional development. So I would include the full gamut of everything you've done, both in terms of your studies and your professional qualifications, and then professional development, extracurricular training, all those sorts of things include in there. And then interests and hobbies are optional. It can be quite nice to have something that kind of feels a bit more personal, and kind of illustrates you and you as a person, what you're interested in. But it's totally whatever you feel comfortable with, really. The thing that isn't on there, but you know, just a little line at the bottom to say references available on request. You don't necessarily need to put the details on there and then. Writing a personal summary, because I think it's one of those things. I think typically it feels quite difficult to write something about yourself which is almost feeling, you know, boastful or really selling yourself. It's not necessarily something that comes naturally, and taking into account you only really want it to take up about a paragraph on a page. Trying to condense all of that into a short space is quite challenging as well. I think if you follow this kind of structure, which is perhaps 4 or 5 sentences, then it becomes a bit easier to think, okay, so 1 or 2 sentences about that, then that, etc. So describe yourself to begin with, who you are, where you're at in your career to date, um, then something around what your abilities and skills are, and what you have, basically what you've achieved in your career so far. And again, that's really important to make that targeted to the role that you're applying to. I would then, from that point, talk about, you know, if you're a qualified accountant, then say that. And anything from your kind of studies and experience that you have picked up that make you a good choice for that role. And then I think a nice way of rounding that all out is something around what that role is going to do for you in your career, and how that ties in with your ambitions, your development, your overall career plan. Because I think, and again, this is something that will be a common theme throughout this presentation, is hiring managers really want to know why you want the role, and not just hear that it's it's the next logical step for you because you've been doing this job for X number of years, and you know this is the step up, so you're going for it. They want to know that it's a really considered decision that you have made, and that you've really thought about why this particular job is right. And so you can just put something in there about that in the personal summary, which I think rounds that section off quite nicely. And then moving on to the employment history section. So talked about the chronology of it. So start with the most recent, work backwards, and as I say, definitely spend more time and kind of the breadth of what you're talking about on the couple of most recent roles. Everything before that you can either bring out in the interview if they ask around it, but it's kind of on the hiring manager to draw that out if they think it's appropriate. Again, as I talked about, I think a nice way of structuring it is to have responsibilities and key achievements linked to one another, so that it's kind of you're showing that you had a grasp of what it was that you were tasked with doing, but then also you've got some really nicely constructed achievements that are relevant to those, and really descriptive. So the way that you structure those is using the STAR technique, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's just a great way of outlining things that you have achieved and showing what the outcome was, and being really it's a nice succinct way of doing it. But also, if you can include as much information that's specific in there as possible, is really important. So I just picked up that message. So STAR is situation, task, action, result. So for anything you might be talking about in your experience, you want to outline what the situation was, what the task that you had to do in relation to that situation was, what action you took to address it, and then what the result was, so what the outcome was. It's just a nice way of going, we had this challenge we had to deal with. My responsibility in that was X. So this is what I did, and this was the outcome. And then the final thing, it's really important to be specific around numbers, things that are specific and measurable and, can be quantified, because on the one hand, it's, you're all finance people, you deal with numbers day to day, but also it just shows that you had a real grasp of what it was that you were doing. And equally, it might not necessarily be that you specifically did something or were the sole person responsible for delivering that. But if you were part of a team that achieved something, then you can still say your role within that was this, and as a team, we delivered this. So I have a couple of examples here, kind of effectively one slightly weaker and one slightly stronger in terms of how you might construct those. So I will stop talking and just show. So this is example number one. And the idea is here is they're both examples will kind of convey the same thing, but one in a slightly less detailed way. So I'll just give a minute or so to read that before we move on to the next one. And then if we move on. You can kind of see from the second example that the main difference here is the inclusion of really specific figures, things that are measurable, and the actual outcomes, so that it shows what you've done and the impact it had in a positive way on the organization. The other thing which was actually flagged, so I full transparency, I took this from ChatGPT because I wouldn't be able to, not being an accountant myself, I wouldn't be able to come up with this myself. You might say for the one which was implementing a new financial reporting system, had you done that, you could say what the system was to be even more specific. In this example, this was something that AI produced. But this is the kind of thing which I think is really impactful. It's the absolute best way of selling yourself on paper, because you're outlining the task, what you had to do, and then some really nice, kind of fairly succinctly written impacts of what you did, what the outcome was, and how it benefited the organization. And that structure, kind of written on paper, is exactly the way that you need to construct answers in an interview setting as well. So if you can get into the habit of doing it when you're writing, it will also help your thought process while you're going into preparing for an interview. Has anyone got any questions on that bit before we move on? Okay, all good. Application planning. This is more for me around kind of how you would prepare for an application as well as them writing a supporting statement. So I think there's just some steps that are really important to go through, I think, if you are going to make the absolute most of the application and give yourself the best chance of success. I think first and foremost, it's really important, of course, to read the job description. With that being said, I think we probably have all experienced that NHS job descriptions can feel quite generic at times, and they will give you the nuts and bolts of what the job entails, but you might not get a feel for anything outside of that. And so it's in my mind, it's really important to do as much research as you possibly can. I know it's a very time consuming process applying to jobs. But I think as long as you've kind of almost got this in front of you so that you can just use it as a checklist and tick things off, it might make it feel a bit easier. So the things you really want to know that are going to give you a feel that won't come across in the job description are, outside of whether the job is for you, is this organization somewhere that I want to work? Are the people there people that I feel I can work with? And do the values align? Is there going to be opportunity for me to grow and develop and all those things? So you want to know who the leadership team is and who you would be reporting into. If there's anyone there that that you might have met in forums such as these, can you get a bit of an offline run through of what it's like to work there and whether they would recommend it to their friends? What's the reputation like in terms of their performance, but also culturally and how they treat their staff? All of those kind of things are really important. And then I think be reflective and really honest with yourself around, am I applying to this because I feel like I have to, or because I really want to? Because if it's the former, the chances are that feeling will impact the way that you kind of prepare for the interview, prepare your application, and the way that you sell yourself. And if it's something that you've gone through a process of going, I've done as much research as I can, I've decided that I really want this job, that will also really come through in your application and the way that you present yourself in the interview. So it's important to kind of have that conversation with yourself, I think. And then finally, but equally importantly, is if it's offered, always take them up on the opportunity to have a pre-conversation with the hiring manager. It's so important to learn the information that you won't get on the job description. All the information that you get from that will be stuff that you can use in the interview, and it gives you an opportunity to hear someone's voice and learn what they're like as a person. Yes, someone had their hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Where you've just said about, is this a job that you really want? And that will show up. Can we just acknowledge that a lot of us are in the situation where we're being told that we may actually have to be applying for essentially to keep our current jobs, with all the changes coming up, and then also that if we are then not chosen to continue working for our current jobs, we are going to then be having to apply for a job because we need jobs. So some of what you said, it's like, yes, if you're looking to take that next step in your career, I fully 100% agree with what you're saying. But a lot of us are probably in this particular training right now because we're aware that we may have to apply to keep our jobs. And if we don't get them, to then look for another job because we have mortgages to pay and life expenses to be able to carry on paying. So it'd be great if you could address that, please.
Yeah, I totally acknowledge that. 100%. I think in my mind, it would still, all of the stuff you might do to prepare will still aid that application and interview process, even in the context that you've described, which I fully, fully appreciate. But it's a really important process, I think, to get into the habit of doing, because the more information that you can gather and the sense that you will get around where you might be applying to and working for will still feed into the way that you're able to articulate things around the organization, and because people will still want to feel like the person that's applying has done that and is able to answer questions in that way. But yeah, 100%, I acknowledge that. And then writing a supporting statement. I guess on the, you know, all of this stuff can just be lifted and shifted into track jobs for the purposes of applying directly to NHS roles. So it's kind of the same structure and things like that. Again, this I think is quite a nice way of structuring it so that it gives you something that you can follow, because again, it's not an easy thing to write, and you might have, in the same way as your CV, you might have a bit of a shell that you tweak just to make sure that it's really targeted and particular to whichever role you're going for. So again, it's kind of expanding on that personal summary in your CV and a bit of a personal thing around who you are and what your personality is, and things that you feel like you're kind of really excelling on in your current role, and things that you are aware that you might need to develop on, and then, you know, what that role can do in terms of that development, and the motivations around, you know, this is a good step for me. I can see that it's going to give me X, Y, and Z, which I feel like are things I would like to develop and also would benefit from developing. Why you want the job, again, mindful of the question that we've just had, but how it can fit in. Question. Peru, do you want to come in?
Yeah, apologies. I'm often on interview panels and I get to see a lot of applications, and people apply online where they have to put in a statement. Is there any guidance on how the length of the statement? Because I've seen some statements which are like 3-4 pages long because they go through the entire history, but whereas this template is quite short and succinct.
I would say if you can keep it to one side of A4 or slightly over one side of A4, that's the optimum length, because I think if you go beyond that, it can just become basically a potted history of everything you've ever done, and it might lose therefore the impactfulness of why is it specifically about this role in this organization and the things that you've done specifically for that. So that would be my advice. And that's, you know, on here, one of the points around why you want the job, really specific to the role and the organization. And so all of the kind of preparatory stuff you've done, the research, you know, the organization, the people, the values, all of those things are things that you want to be able to reference in the supporting statement to show that you've done that research. And then suitability for the job is, I think if you make a statement about that in the opening paragraph, you can then really broaden that out across a few paragraphs in the supporting statement. What have you achieved already? What have you done that you think would be specifically beneficial to the organization, or that you could bring across into this role? But also, what haven't you achieved that you want to, and where you think this might help you get to that point. So covering off those 2 points is really important, I think. And then a nice thing to round it off, I think, or to get to a conclusion point, is talking about the organizational values, how they align to your personal values, and how you believe that you are able to demonstrate those in your day-to-day work. It might be nice as well to just have a summary paragraph at the end, just rounding all of that up and then reaffirming your interest in the role. But again, if I think if you follow this structure, then you should be onto a winner. Any questions there before moving on? Yes, Tracy.
So with this template and what we've covered so far, if you have 40 years worth of working experience, how far do you go back? I mean, obviously common sense says you apply what you need to for a particular application. But generally, how far would you go back?
I would probably say, so in that instance, you would probably go the most relevant experience there is probably going to be the sort of the last 5 years, or between 5 and 10 years. But with that being said, I think if there are particular things you've done over that 40-year period that are really relevant, there's absolutely nothing to say that you shouldn't include that. But in a way where it's really transferable and relevant just specifically to the role.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
No worries. Dorcas?
Yeah. You talked about the fact that you can make contact with an organization in order to get to know how the team works, what's the reputation of the organization, and things like that. That might give you that positive feedback in order for you to apply for a job in that particular organization. But most of the time, the person that you might contact, for example, the person responsible for the interview, might tell you that their organization is the best, but it might not be the best. How do you think we can go around that element?
I think in that instance, it goes back to the point around whether you can identify anyone else in your network who either has worked there recently or is currently working there. I mean, I have always said this to kind of anyone I cross paths with, that it might not be a really obvious thing to think about doing, but if you know someone in my position who kind of works for a recruitment company whose role it is day to day is to know, as many people as possible in as many organizations as possible, then a very easy thing to do is to just drop a message or pick up the phone to say, I'm looking at this role. Do you know what it's like there, or do you know anyone there that you might put me in touch with? I mean, I can't speak on behalf of everyone that does the job that I do, but I know from my perspective that I wouldn't think twice about connecting you to someone or giving you a bit of an honest opinion based on what I know and what my experience is of either working with that person or that organization. But there's definitely ways around it that you can get an honest view, and that works in the same way that I'm mindful that not every single job and not every single hiring manager will offer a pre-conversation. So in that instance as well, the same applies.
Yes, you're correct. Yeah.
Michelle?
Hi. Yeah. Obviously mentioned by someone earlier, we're all going through a major change. The odds are that there won't be enough jobs within the NHS for finance staff. And particularly those people who are in NHS England or the ICBs who'll be looking at trust roles as options where they're available. There seems, particularly as you get more senior, there seems to be quite a blockage to transferring, even when you try to demonstrate transferable skills, that you could work in an acute trust or a mental health trust when you've worked in an ICB or NHS England. And also when you're applying to external roles, there's almost you're institutionalized because you've worked in the NHS and you can therefore only work in the NHS. How do you cross that barrier when you're doing these applications?
It's a really good question, because I've seen that, I've experienced that in my role, and I don't necessarily have the answer to that outside of speaking to as many people you can who have the experience that perhaps you don't, that can help guide you through what's really important to include, if you can manage to get hold of someone that might know the hiring manager, that you can get a sense of what's going to be really important to them, and then you can tailor what you're putting together in your application around that, just to get your foot in the door, and also try and have a direct conversation with that hiring manager to understand that, and maybe be quite direct in questioning and saying, look, I'm mindful I might not have all of the provider experience. Can you be honest with me and tell me if that's going to be a problem? And just try and piece things together that way. I mean, I that's about as best as I've got, because I'm mindful of that challenge. But having said that, I've also seen lots of people make that switch and be successful, and so it's not as though there is a blanket ruling that it can't happen and it can't be successful to go from one sector to the other. But I don't necessarily have all the answers to that, I'm afraid. I think it's just a case of doing as much as you can in terms of research and conversations, and actually finding out exactly what it is that they're after, and then doing everything you can to shape what you put together to meet that.
Thank you.
No worries. I think there was a question in the chat as well around covering that you've met the specification. I would try and include that quite early on in your supporting statement, and then so if you include that in your effectively either in the opening or just after the opening, then almost in like answering an essay question, you can then provide your argument as to why that's the case, and here's all the reasoning and the things that I've done that make this true. So that would be my advice to that. Any more questions before we move on to interviews? Okay. So preparing for the interview is much like all the other preparation you will have done in terms of the application. I think you will want to, the first things first is just to have absolutely nailed down your personal experience and all the things that you might talk about if you're going to give an answer to either a scenario-based question that shows kind of the softer skills, or indeed more technical-based questions. Have prepared a couple of examples that you can bring to life to articulate that, and just pretty much learn them off by heart would be my advice. Use the STAR technique again, but I think here what's quite a nice interview technique is to add reflection to the end of that. So giving a really nicely put together answer around, this was the situation, this is what I or we as a team did, this was the outcome, but then also bolting onto the end of that how you have reflected on that whole scenario and what you took from it, what you learned from it, whether it was a positive outcome or a negative outcome. I think there's always one of our company values at Hunter Healthcare is learn or learn, because the viewpoint is in a scenario where you kind of win and you get a positive outcome, or you don't do so well and it was a negative outcome. In either scenario, there is something that you can learn from that for the next time, and being able to articulate that in an interview I think is quite impressive, and not necessarily something that other people do. Again, research is going to be really important. If you have had pre-conversations either with the hiring manager or indeed with other people in the organization, I would go back over all of those notes and just be really confident on what's important to the organization, what's important to this hiring manager, what is success going to look like as far as you have been able to ascertain through those conversations, and then shaping your answers around that so that it's in your interview, your answers are kind of always drilling back down into the point of, I've done a lot of homework on this. I know my stuff inside out, and this is why it's relevant to this particular role. If you can look at things like board papers, annual reports, just to give a flavour of kind of organisational performance, and again that thing around what are the key priorities for this organisation? How does this role fit into those priorities? What are they likely to ask me about based on where they're at as an organisation? Again, that's going to make you feel more comfortable in terms of how you prepare, what you think might come up in the interview, all of those things. Values, again, if you've included that in your personal, your supporting statement, then chances are you will already know them, but just go back over those and again make sure that you're clear on how you align to them and how kind of they make you feel, and how you're able to put those into practice and demonstrate those day to day in work. And then if you weren't able to have conversations with people prior to your application, then try and do it before you interview to understand a bit around again the challenges, the priorities, what it's like to work there. If it's a culture that you think you would kind of really excel in, then it's good to know that, because you can then use that to bolster your answers and you know, anything that they might ask, because the chances are they're going to say one of the questions they will ask you first is either why do you want this role, or why would you like to work here. The more research you've done, the easier it will become to answer that question. And then on the day, first of all, it's important to look the part, and definitely better to be overdressed than underdressed, I would say. I'm mindful as well that lots of interviews take place on Teams. I would still, you know, whether it's kind of, you know, I would avoid having kind of tracksuits on your bottom half and then smart on the top half. I think if you just kind of address smart for the occasion, it will make you rise to the occasion and feel like you're kind of ready to perform. In terms of communicating, it's important, I think, to make sure that you are kind of addressing everyone on the panel, and you know, regular eye contact with people, looking around the room if there are multiple people on the panel. I know again on Teams that becomes a little harder to achieve, but you know, always looking at the screen upright, try and avoid catching yourself in the corner on the screen and things like that. Peru, yeah, go ahead.
I often have problems looking at people in the eye,
Okay.
even whether it's face to face or even on screen. And I just wanted to ask, have you got any tips on how to present yourself if you do have issues with that visual, you know, disparity when you're talking to people? You know, and also when I'm focused, I look really angry or stressed, and it's not because I'm angry or stressed, it's just my facial expression goes into that default position that I am focused very singly on something. Have you got any tips?
That's a really good point. I think the first thing is practice, and if you can almost get, you know, go through a process of doing it lots of times in practice with someone that you know quite well, just to almost feel a bit more comfortable doing it, almost so, you know, it becomes a bit more like a robotic process rather than something that you're really mindful of. That might work. To be honest, I think that the like something that everyone is really keen to see in someone, and I've just seen that from Michelle. That's a really good thing as well, a really good example. But also people love to know that they are talking to someone or potentially hiring someone that's self-aware. And so I actually don't think there's any harm in almost verbalizing it and saying, I know I do this, like, please don't think that I'm, you know, not excited to be here, or, you know, whatever it is. You know, I don't actually think there's any harm in verbalizing that, because if you're able to recognize about yourself, then it's something that you kind of know you can work on. So I think the fact that you know that you can do it, and as Naomi says, if it's on Teams, then that also becomes a bit easier. But yeah, looking at kind of either just above or just below is a good idea. Similar to kind of doing public speaking and things like that, I think. And don't be afraid of silences and pauses if you need a bit of time to think or digest what someone said and make sure that you've understood the question correctly. I think there's a bit of a human tendency to want to fill silences, but it will never reflect negatively or work against you in an interview if you just take a few seconds, because I think we can all feel like 5 seconds of silence probably feels like 30 seconds. But if you can get comfortable, then it's definitely better to make sure that you've digested and understood the question, and then give the right answer, as opposed to filling the silence and then kind of muddling your thoughts. Notes, my personal view is there is nothing wrong with bringing notes into interviews. What you want to avoid is always looking down and kind of reading from a script and then not looking up and addressing the room. I think a glance down to make sure that you've remembered something is absolutely fine, as long as the majority of the time you're kind of looking up. I have heard, so it's a bit of a funny thing, because I remember responding to that question in a previous session, and someone said that they were marked down, or in the feedback it reflected negatively on them that they brought notes in. I just don't. I think that's pretty out of order, if I'm honest, and maybe it just means it wasn't the right place to go and work, frankly, because I think, you know, you shouldn't be tasked in an interview with remembering absolutely everything, because it's not a memory test. It's, you know, finding the right person for the right team. So personally, my view is absolutely fine, provided you're not always reading from them. And a kind of secondary point in terms of that kind of silences and pauses things, don't be afraid to ask, either to repeat the question or kind of say, just so I'm clear, I've understood what you said to mean this. Is that correct? If not, can you just clarify for me? Again, it's more important to make sure that the answer you give is the relevant and right one, as opposed to, you know, giving an answer that you think is what they asked and then it wasn't, and you end up going off on a bit of a tangent unnecessarily. I think there's no harm in asking for clarification. And then I think this came up again actually last week in a session. So I always think when someone says, have you got any questions for us at the end, it's nice to have 1 or 2 prepared. And if they've already answered those questions in the course of the interview, then you can say, well, I did actually want to ask these, but, you know, gratefully you've already answered them. And then someone said, because the things you want to avoid is like asking, well, how many days am I allowed to work from home in this role? Because you want to, you know, you can, if you get appointed, you can have that conversation afterwards, but you want to know I guess the things that you might ask at the end of an interview should be things that demonstrate your keenness and your priorities for what you want out of the role and in the organization. So things like, what does success look like in the first 12 months, or what, you know, how might I develop and progress in this organization, and things like that, that show some ambition and want for success, and things like that, I think are really useful to ask. someone also said, it was a CFO that said, you can also use that time, and this answers your question, Dorcas. You can use that time to basically just give another sort of minute or two of selling yourself and a bit of spiel around, look, really appreciate being here and thank you for your time. I just want to kind of use this time to reaffirm these are the reasons why I think I'm right for this role and this organization. And, I, really look forward to hearing from you soon, or something like that, that just means that they're giving you a bit of a platform to say something. So use it to do something that's going to enhance your chances of getting the role and leaving a bit more of a lasting impression. And I think that pretty much rounds it out. The only thing I would say before we have any more questions is the thing I mentioned earlier around, not necessarily thinking that you might know a recruiter who can help put you in touch with someone, or might know someone that they can give you a bit of informal information around. As I said, I am always more than happy to do that and help out in any way I possibly can. It can be quite a useful thing to do and really help your application process and your interview process. So my details are on that slide. Please feel free to take them down. And if you've got stuff you're applying to that you want to know a bit more information about and it's something I can help with, more than happy to do so. Equally, if you want some help putting your CV together or your supporting statement or a bit of interview prep, again, absolutely no strings attached, but more than helpful to help out in any way. Sorry, more than happy to help out in any way I can. So please don't feel like you can't ask. And any questions from anyone to finish off, I will happily answer. Michelle?
Obviously, you said that you're focused on healthcare. Do you have private sector roles as well? So if we are many of us have said already looking for other roles, probably external to the NHS or possibly, is that an area that you may also be able to help with as an agency?
Yeah, exactly. So we're a healthcare specialist, but that's kind of the full spectrum. So in essence, we would cover anything that's either linked to or impacts healthcare. So private healthcare consulting firms, healthcare charities, and mental health charities and things like that. Areas of central government, like the Department of Health and their arm's length bodies, all organisations that we do and have worked with.
Thank you.
No problem. Anyone else before we wrap up? As I say, these will all be shared around, but if anyone has any things that they would either like to discuss offline or just want a bit of advice on prepping for things, then feel free to reach out to me directly. All right.
Cool. Have you seen all the ones and answered all the ones in the chat?
Oh,
I don't know if you've seen them.
perhaps not. I haven't actually. Here we go. How do you prepare for interviews? Interesting one with so Catherine, your question about doing a presentation. It's that's a tricky one, because I guess what they're asking for is your interpretation of what they've given you, even if it's loose. And so I think, to be honest, the first place I would go for that is just enlisting some help from someone you might know, or again, being put in touch with someone you might know that might be able to just give you a second opinion on their interpretation of that, to make so you can kind of trade notes and go, look, I've taken it to mean this. Am I on the right lines? And someone else, particularly someone who's might be doing that role already or has done that role previously might just go, oh, this is probably what they're asking for. But I would also, when you start the presentation, just make it really clear this is how you've interpreted it, and therefore your presentation is based on that, as opposed to, anything else. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you. I think you might have hit everyone else's. Maybe did you, Dorcas asked, can you share tips to make a lasting impression during online interviews versus in-person interviews?
I thought I had answered that question, but I didn't realize it was kind of online versus. I think the way that you will make a lasting impression in any interview, whether it's in person or on screen, is your ability to convey detailed, specific, and I guess, if necessary, complex information in a very clear manner, and always being consistent in answering the question in that way. So using that STAR technique with the additional R, I think, is a good way of doing that, particularly as you are being able to show sort of self-awareness, or that you're quite reflective and you're always looking to learn from something, whether it's positive or negative, is not, in my experience, not something that lots of people do. I also think you will be up against people who, if you've gone through this whole process of research and preparation, there will be lots of people that might get interviews that haven't done this, and so that will also help make you stand out. In terms of it being on Teams, I think you might have the benefit that you can have some notes up on the screen that it's not then obvious that you're looking. That can also help, but again, just try not to be obvious that you're always looking in the corner of the screen. Try and look central, be sat upright, and come across well that way. Perry, you had a hand up.
One tip, it was a feedback that I received. I had an online interview and I had notes all over my screen, and one of the panel members, because it's an internal role, said to me afterwards, he goes, we could tell that you were looking at notes because of the reflection in my glasses. So they could see the reflection with all the yellow post-its and pink ones all over the place. So just a tip if you're wearing glasses.
Good point.
That's a good tip.
That is a good tip.
Is that everything?
I think so, yeah. Just looking at the chat, I think that's everything, yeah.
Oh, and then just loads and loads of thank yous. But yeah, thank you so much, Will. Appreciate you coming to speak today. We hit over 100 people on the call, and we've recorded it for those that weren't able to join as well, so that's fantastic. So yeah, 5 minutes back in the diary for everyone to be able to get a cup of tea before their next call or something. Thank you again, Will, and thanks everyone else. Have a lovely day.
Likewise, thank you everyone, and as I say, please don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of help. Thanks a lot.